Good afternoon and welcome to our event, The Ties That Bind, Investing in Charitable Organizations. I'm Heather Bakken, President of the Canadian Club of Ottawa. While we're meeting on a virtual platform, I would like to acknowledge the rights of the Indigenous people to the land that each one of us is on as we watch this. For the Canadian Club of Ottawa, it is the unsurrendered and unceded territory of the Algonquin. Anishinaabe are the original inhabitants of the land where the Parliament buildings overlook the Ottawa River, which is just downstream from one of the most sacred places for Indigenous peoples. Negotiations are currently underway for a modern-day treaty in what is known as the Algonquins of Ontario settlement area, which covers 36,000 square kilometers in eastern Ontario. Miigwech. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. If your internet quality is poor, there is a click here to switch stream button, which will reduce the video bandwidth, but protect the audio so you can still follow along with the conversation. If you have any other technical issues, please look at the request help bubble. Click on that and send your issue. A response will be emailed to the address that you used when you registered for the event. You can ask a question at any time during today's webcast by simply clicking on the questions tab, submitting your question. We will get to those questions or as many questions as we can in the Q&A to engage all of you in this timely discussion. We, of course, are grateful to our corporate sponsors, RBC, Royal Bank, and Shaw Communications for their ongoing support throughout the season this year. We are greatly appreciative of that. And to our gold sponsors, Welsh LLP, Strategy Corp, and TD Bank. Our media partners for the 2021 virtual season are Impact Public Affairs, iPolitics, The Hill Times, and the Ottawa Business Journal. And now we have a message from one of them for you.
iPolitics is a proud sponsor of the Canadian Club Ottawa. If you enjoy policy issues and would like a daily dose of policy news, stay tuned for the virtual draw after the panel discussion to win a free subscription to iPolitics.
Thanks very much, Franca. While the pandemic has compelled many Canadians to look at their communities with renewed appreciation and to recognize the power of working collectively, it has also increased the demand for charitable services, which has caused critical challenges for the delivery of the essential services they provide. Today's discussion will examine the diversity of these organizations, the unique challenges they've had in responding to the pandemic, how they've been forced to adapt, and what their priorities are post-pandemic. It's my pleasure now to pass the microphone over to a fellow director at the Canadian Club of Ottawa. Zina Sereni is a familiar face in Ottawa's business community. Many of you may have seen her as a pharmacist and owner of the Glebe Apothecary, which is a division of Shoppers Drug Mart. But Zina has been deeply involved in the charitable sector throughout this crisis, particularly in her role on the board of directors with United Way East Ontario. She's also been an organizing force behind today's event. So without any further ado, over to you, Zina.
Great, thank you, Heather. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for today's event, Michael Allen. He's the president and CEO of United Way East Ontario. Michael was born in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and after 22 years in this community that he now calls Ottawa home. Following a career that saw Michael practicing law and then working on Parliament Hill, Michael was drawn to United Way by the opportunity to help others in his adopted community. For Michael, what really sealed the deal was the ice storm, which took place during his first year at United Way. He said, and I quote, "I wanted United Way to be thought of as a place where the community could turn to in these different times of need. More and more often, that's happening today." For Michael, working at United Way is a constant source of inspiration. Our volunteers are here helping out in their spare time, and our staff is extremely committed and motivated. We share a common goal of helping others in their community. And with that, I'll hand it over to Michael to introduce our panelists today and to begin today's event.
Zina and Heather, thank you so much for that introduction, but moreover for hosting this. I know, Heather, you indicated to us that this is the season finale for the Canadian Club, and as someone who has lived here the majority of my working life, I can tell you that the Canadian Club has been a regular fixture for me, and this is the first time I've done so on Zoom, and so we're looking forward to going back to the hotel and the beautiful ballroom at the Chateau Laurier and resuming that in some probably hybrid form as we move forward. But I can't tell you how appreciative I am, I'm sure as my colleagues on the panel today, to have this opportunity to speak to your audience from across Canada about the role that the community sector has played in what has been a global pandemic, but has been experienced on the ground locally in thousands of Canadian communities across the country. I am delighted to introduce them to you, and I'll do so in alphabetical order. First of all, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Amy Avis. Amy was appointed the General Counsel for the Canadian Red Cross in 2017 and has been with the organization for over 10 years. In this role, Amy oversees a team of legal and risk professionals, and her role includes compliance, critical incident management, personal security, and public policy. Amy is a member of the Charities Directorate Technical Issues Working Group, and in 2015 represented the Canadian humanitarian sector in the Global Financial Action Task Force consultations in London and Vienna. Amy has a further operational role, and this is very, very important in the context of our conversation today, in specialized emergency management and operate service lines for granting and case management for small businesses and individuals. During her over 10 years with the Canadian Red Cross, Amy has supported the Red Cross's major large-scale operations domestically, internationally, including the Fort McMurray fires, the BC fires, and most recently, of course, COVID-19. Amy, welcome to today's panel. Next, I'd like to introduce Andrew Tunninghall. Andrew brings a background of education in economics and commerce to the table today. Andrew obtained his chartered accountant designation in 2002 and began his career at PricewaterhouseCoopers. Andrew joined Community Foundations in Canada in 2013 and became the Chief Executive Officer in 2017, following a 6-year tenure as Vice President of Finance for the London Community Foundation. Now, as the head of the Community Foundation movement across Canada, Andrew is working closely with the Community Foundations of Canada leadership team, their board, and foundations in the country and abroad to help the philanthropic sector transform, innovate, and meet new challenges and opportunities of the 21st century. Outside of the Community Foundations of Canada, Andrew has been highly active in the nonprofit community for 15 years, serving on numerous boards, including Community Living London and Art for AIDS International. In our technical briefing yesterday, Andrew described himself as someone who is a disruptor, a provocateur, and who is eager to embrace and provoke uncomfortable conversations. So, Andrew, we're going to count on you for that today. And finally, my colleague, Dan Clement. Dan is our president and CEO of United Ways Canada, where he leads our national movement for social change comprising 79 community-based federated United Way organizations across the country. With over 1,000 staff, 200,000 volunteers, and more than 1 million donors, United Way Centraides raise and invest more than $500 million annually, serving more than 5,000 Canadian communities. United Way Centraides in Canada focus on ensuring people move from a life of poverty to one of possibility, that communities are built on sustained, healthy people, and that kids can be all that they can be. Together with major agencies and partners, United Ways improve lives locally. As part of an international network, United Way Centraides Canada links with United Ways worldwide to share best practices and build on capacity in 44 member countries, investing over $5 billion US per year. Dan engages with stakeholders through donor, government, and media relations, engaging in public policy development to drive the United Way mission forward. Dan has more than 20 years of leadership experience within the United Way movement at the local, provincial, and national levels, including 11 years at United Way Centraides. Ladies and gentlemen, we have about 40 minutes on our panel today, so we've got a few questions that we've discussed that we hope will cover the waterfront in terms of the kind of conversation you're anxious to hear. But as Heather indicated, please feel free to pose any questions that might have, and we'll deal with that towards the end of our time together today. And so while we have three very significant national leaders, all of them have experience at every level of philanthropy in our country, and certainly have been at the forefront of the pandemic's response in Canada over the past year plus. So let me start Amy, with you, if I may. And if you can just describe how your organization has responded to the pandemic over the past year at its height, and frankly, during its third wave, and how has the crisis response, perhaps from your perspective, been characterized nationally versus what's happened at the local level?
Sure, and thank you so much for the privilege of speaking with you all today. And, as phrased, I'm kind of here in my specialized recovery role, and I can't help but be a lawyer sometimes, and so please forgive me for that, but I will be focusing on operational elements. The Canadian Red Cross started before the pandemic had hit Canada. We were working frontline with travelers in Trenton and Nav, and we were trying to figure out kind of how to grapple with the virus and its impacts. And I remember kind of sitting around a table in early days trying to figure out what level of PPE, how it might affect communities. And we had sent our teams overseas to work with those who were stranded in Japan as concierge support. And so as I kind of reflect on that to today, where the Red Cross continues to be active in 91 sites across the country, we're tremendously proud of our interventions in long-term care, both at like a community level, but also in terms of our contributions, I would say, that we're proud of in terms of our collaboration with federal, provincial, and territorial actors. One thing that I'd be remiss if I don't reflect on, though, is our work with the Emergency Community Support Fund in the nonprofit sector. And I'm cognizant of time, so I'll go through this quite quickly. But what I do think is really interesting is, the charitable sector, as we term it, is broken down in both charities and nonprofits, of course. And nonprofits, and they're qualified donees, or so they're not qualified donees. And so there's this kind of regulatory barrier to funding them. They're largely opaque. And so when we talk about the 160,000 organizations across Canada, the nonprofits are said to make up half of that, and yet we know very little about them. One thing that I'd like to speak to, because I think the story of the Canadian Red Cross's response in COVID is the story of these community agencies and who they supported and served. And so I'd just like to tell you about who they are from our perspective. They're effective and efficient. They have an average revenue of $100,000, and they have 4 volunteers to every staff person. They, even when their revenue increases, the number of staff don't increase for these organizations, which is really remarkable, because if you put it alongside the charitable sector, and of course as a registered charity, I'm not criticizing the sector. I'm noting, in fact, though, that the nonprofit sector seems to be disproportionately reliant on community volunteers. And perhaps this is kind of why we see that this sector, or this group, is largely representative of the populations they serve. So over 67% of those organizations self-identified as being representative of the population they're supporting in their community. And we're proud of the fact that in our work with that fund, we worked with 18% Black Canadians, 15% Indigenous, 5% Asian, 30% newcomers, to name a few. And so when we really look at this, we were able to kind of have these groups self-identify and self-determine what their community needed. And so in some cases that was, food security and creating, farming and sustainable food sources in Indigenous communities. Or in some cases, it was around kind of delivery of packages and essential supplies. And I've put my timer, and I have a tendency to ramble, and I was threatened that if I spoke too much, then the next couple of times I'd be punished for it. So I'll just close with a really quick story, which is to say, one remarkable moment in the last year was when we were invited to, and I'm not going to say the name right, but I think it's Lifting Two Spirits. And it was this Indigenous group that presented, and they did a drag show with like throat singing, and, it was like, they did cultural dances, and the best form of drag I think I've ever seen. And, to look at the fact that they were able to create a virtual community when there's so much isolation, and the degree to which kind of that connectedness is kind of what brings us across the finish line of COVID. It's just a remarkable privilege to have been able to work with these groups. And I hope today that I can kind of speak to a sector that's not kind of largely spoken about. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Amy. And you did well in terms of your time. Andrew, let me turn to you. I know that one of the things that Amy mentioned here, of course, was that these 3 organizations were identified by the federal government as as organizations to aid them in ensuring the sector was addressed in terms of their response to the pandemic. And I know one of the things that we did at a local level was ensure that we work with our local Red Crosses and our local community foundations, ensuring that we weren't bumping into each other and as effective as possible with the dollars that we had. Can you give us a sense of some of the priorities and focuses that the Community Foundation network across Canada dealt with during the pandemic?
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Heather and Zena, for giving me the opportunity to speak today. Yes, we collaborated with the Canadian Red Cross and the United Way as part of the broader Emergency Community Support Fund. And I think all three organizations had unique roles and positions in that deployment. Community foundations really saw this as a way to provide stability and sustainability to charities throughout Canada in a period where their liquidity was severely restricted and where operations was key. And so where we focused our time and energy was around shoring up our most significant and most important community partners in communities across Canada. And we have 191 individual community foundations. So we didn't really set the priority at the national level. We made funds available, and then community foundations then took it upon themselves to determine their priorities, where the liquidity could be best served, and then moving money through. Part of the arrangement with the federal government, it was that community foundations themselves would leverage federal dollars. We learned some interesting things that we had a notion of, but became more visible as we came through the deployment of the Emergency Community Support Fund. And that was, as community foundations, as philanthropic organizations, we are very much place-based organizations. And we built a very robust data platform to capture data about where grants were going, but where grants weren't going. And we discovered that the system of philanthropic funders was leaving behind certain parts of Canada, leaving behind certain communities. Racialized communities were not receiving the same level of granting that other communities were receiving. Rural and remote and northern parts of Canada were being left behind. We even had a report that came out late last year called Unfunded, and that was commissioned by the Foundation for Black Communities, which indicated less than 1% of granting from philanthropic organizations actually go to Black-led or Black-serving communities. We heard the same from Indigenous communities as well. And one of the ways that community foundations responded to that was to get behind and support identity-based philanthropic infrastructure in Canada. And that would work and coalesce alongside our infrastructure, which is place-based philanthropic infrastructure. So two organizations were created during the pandemic. One is the Foundation for Black Communities, which is a national philanthropic infrastructure to specifically support Black communities and the Black diaspora across Canada. Black Canadians represent over 3.5% of the Canadian population. The other initiative that is off the ground is the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund. And Community Foundations of Canada incubates that organization, and they hope to have charitable status at some point this year. And that fund is deploying across Canada to many Indigenous communities, particularly rural and remote Indigenous communities. In both instances, community foundations provided capital and granting to seed those organizations and to help them flourish. And we're really proud of that work. We recognize that our institutions have left people behind, but we can certainly help infrastructure show up in those gaps so that Canada has the right type of philanthropic infrastructure it needs to support all Canadians.
Thank you, Andrew. It's I'm looking forward to perhaps another question on our roster today about what the future looks like and the intersections of place-based versus identity-based, and in doing so, let me flip this then to Dan. Dan and I have had, as you might appreciate, a number of conversations over the course of the pandemic, and I know he'll have some insights about what the national office versus the local United Ways have done. And Dan, I suspect that one of the dynamics that we have intersected with your colleagues on the panel and their organizations is that our approach has been around issue-based challenges, and particularly issues that were presented and highlighted by the pandemic. But perhaps you can just give an overview of how the United Way movement has operated both at a national and local level.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And it's great to be on the panel with everybody. And, I think you touched on it right at the beginning, Michael. You mentioned, the pandemic's been a global crisis at local scale. And I actually think that's why the charitable sector and the community sector has been so fundamentally important. And what that's really meant for us is, it's playing out differently, different pace, different communities have different infrastructure, different scale. And for us, it's been really important to anchor, right? If we're going to respond to the pandemic, how do we anchor our decision-making and our response and our engagement at the local level? And for us as, 76 or 79 United Ways across Canada, serving all parts of the country, it was really important as a national organization to really buttress and support our local United Ways to play that role and that knowledge gathering role that they played. And a lot of that for us was then as a national level is what are we learning? And how are we making sense of this? And how is it that as the pandemic rolls at a different pace across the country, how do we then use that as a guide to support good public policy advocacy, engagement with partners, and strategic investments? So I think fundamentally, if we did not have a strong community services sector in Canada, we would have had even a greater challenge in terms of responding to this pandemic. The second thing for me, and Michael, you and I have talked about this a lot, but it's been an all hands on deck kind of time, right? And you've got three great organizations that have worked really closely together over the past years as an example. But for us, it's been essential that both at a local and a national scale, that all of our organizations come together to figure out how are we going to adapt and respond. So I think about that locally, and I know in Ottawa and the East Ontario, you've had your community response table, but we've had community response tables and now community recovery tables that have had United Way leadership, foundation leadership, municipalities, public health organizations, and they have mobilized like from the very beginning of this pandemic with community organizations to say, we're facing disruption. At the beginning of this pandemic, not only businesses shut down, but community organizations had to figure out how to adapt. Gaps were formed, and yet basic need took off. So this community response table model that has really evolved across the country, I think has been fundamentally important. And I actually think it's something that we need to keep talking about is how do we actually hold on to these structures into the recovery and into the long-term investment in our communities. And at a national level, this played out in a whole bunch of different ways, especially with the federal government. In our case, we worked with Community Foundations of Canada, Red Cross, and Amy touched on this, but we worked on the Emergency Community Support Fund, which was $350 million invested across the country at a local level, local decision-making, which was fundamental. But the other things that we also were able to do with this sort of local base of United Ways of knowledge is, within the first couple of weeks of this pandemic, we partnered with the federal government to launch the New Horizons for Seniors program. $9 million out the door into communities, supported over 870 local organizations that immediately responded within 12 weeks to get supports for isolated seniors. And just an example of how fast our national networks and our local leadership on the ground can move. So that's an example. Another example was how important community navigation was. As services got disrupted and we had a whole new group of Canadians that were feeling the impact of the pandemic, we had lots of folks needing community services and didn't know where to turn. So another piece of work that United Way Canada did with our partners, both with the federal government and local United Ways, was actually expand our 2-on-1 service. So for the first time during the pandemic, we achieved 100% coverage so that every Canadian from all regions of the country could actually access facilitated support in terms of how to connect with community services. And maybe I'll conclude on this point, Michael, and it's a point I'll probably come back to. But if I think about all of the disruption and the change and the local adaptation, the most important thing, or one of the most important things that I really think has emerged from this conversation and this work, is this idea of flexible funding. So in charity, in philanthropy, we've gone for the last decade plus, I think, increasingly towards targeted giving, short-term projects, initiative-based focus work. And what was the number one thing that we needed at the beginning of this pandemic through the past 14 months? Flexible, adaptive resources that allow communities to respond, to fill a gap where it was there, and to innovate. And I think that tells us something about philanthropy, tells us something about how we need to invest. And I think it tells us that we really need to think hard about how we bring flexibility back into how we support community organizations. So there's a theme there for me, something I'd love to dig into as we get into the conversation. And it touches on a lot of the things around equity as well in community serving organizations. So I'll stop there, Michael, and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you all. And so let me then just turn the page a little bit, recognizing that Canada included, but certainly many other parts of the globe are perhaps in the worst part of this pandemic. This third wave has been as punishing, if not more so, for many parts of our communities as any previous part of the pandemic. But there will be a day when the page does get turned, and we will start thinking about what the recovery looks like. And so one of the things I know that we've talked about locally is that the pandemic has taught us a lot about where the weaknesses are, where the disparities are, where the challenges are. And one of the most encouraging ambitions that I harbor is that many voices are now coalescing around some of those lessons, the lessons of social inequities, the lessons that have held back the recovery. And it was just the other day that the governor of the Bank of Canada was reported to be speaking about how the importance of how the economic recovery must be more equitable in order for us to overcome another punishing wave of crisis like COVID-19. And we will not have recovered if we do not address those issues. And so from your perspective, I wonder if I can ask you, what sort of priorities do you see as we emerge into a economic recovery, and in terms of what sort of priorities your organization will be focusing on as we move forward in a post-pandemic environment? And Andrew, let me start with you this time.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I also read that article in the Globe and Mail on Tiff Macklin, and then, in fact, the quote is, "We are in the sharpest and most unequal economic cycle in our lifetime." And we're hearing things like, let's build back better, let's have a just recovery, let's build a resilient and inclusive economy. What this means is we have to do things transformatively different than we've done in the past. We can't build on what currently exists. Incrementalism and definitely status quo is not on. And I think that's a challenge for the charitable sector. And I think we're having those conversations now. I think we're starting to turn the page, as you said. I completely agree with Dan around flexible funding. I think that's ultimately one of the most critical things we have to focus in on. However, the regulatory barriers are something that we need to talk to the Canada Revenue Agency about. Every charitable business model requires transformation. Transformation requires money. We have this system where all of our dollars, I think in the Income Tax Act, it says virtually all of our dollars are supposed to be spent on charitable purposes. Within those constraints, how do we find the room and the resources to create new services, new delivery of products, innovate the way that we work? Innovation requires money. And we have to draw upon funders, particularly the ones that I represent in the Community Foundation movement, to be flexible with their funding. We have to provide multi-year funding. We have to provide funding for operational costs. We have to sometimes pick up the entire tab. We have to lower the level of bureaucracy and paperwork associated with our funding levels. And Amy mentioned this earlier on about the qualified donee versus non-qualified donee element between charities and nonprofits. There are many organizations doing charitable work in racialized communities, in northern, rural, and remote communities that do not have registered charity status. And the direction and control laws in this country are colonial based. They end up being racist policies, and they prohibit capital and funding from going to the most vulnerable communities in our country. If we are serious about equality, like if we are taking Tiff Macklin's words seriously, then we have to advocate for changing the regulatory framework around charities in this country. They are archaic. They are holding us back, and they are preventing us from actually innovating the business model of charities and funders. So we cannot move forward until we have that very important discussion. Our charitable laws in this country are reflective of 100 years ago. We have social entrepreneurs who are doing excellent work, who do not classify as charities and cannot get funding, or find it very difficult to get funding in Canada from foundations and other funders. So there's a future out there that wants us to tackle inequality, that wants transformation, but we need the regulatory and legal framework to be accommodative of that. And that is the work over the next few years.
Thank you, Andrew. Dan, let me go to you next, but let me just build on a thought a string of thoughts that are occurring to me, that your comment about flexible funding and the challenges of the framework, regulatory or legislative that Andrew mentions. Notwithstanding, my sense is that we are entering into a post-pandemic moment, at least a transformational moment, when the alignment of a sense of priorities around inequities, around social justice, may never be higher, with government, with enlightened corporate interests. And I do think there's an opportunity there that the sector should grasp, recognizing that the importance of philanthropy is considerable because of its nimbleness, because of its flexibility, but notwithstanding, can we leverage that enlightened moment that we are potentially within to address some of these social justice and equity issues?
Yeah, I think, I was having a conversation with one of my board members this summer, and it was in the middle of the George Floyd protests and the conversations around race. And this is one of my board members who works a lot on equity. And I said, so Anne, I said, you think this is going to stick? Do you think this is really going to be the moment that all of our organizations and our communities really strive for change? And what she said to me, and it has stuck with me. She goes, "Well, people have short memories, Dan." And I've kept on to that because when I think about this pandemic, and I feel like we all want it to be over. We're in the third wave, and we're getting vaccinated. We say, "Oh, it's going to be over, and everything's going to go back to normal." Well, I think the charitable sector and the community sector has to be the sector that reminds Canadians that, in fact, the pandemic didn't cause the inequities. The pandemic didn't cause the inequitable distribution of impacts. The pandemic didn't cause Canada's terrible performance on long-term care and deaths in long-term care. These were conditions that existed, and the pandemic simply revealed them for what they were. Inequitable access to resources, not thoughtful enough program and organizational design. So I really think the invitation for all of us is to not rush to everything's back to normal, to actually really dig in to say, we took a year to talk about vulnerable workers and the need for sick leave. That's not acceptable. Like, the impacts were clear. It took too long. Let's keep talking about those issues. Let's talk about the fact that we have grassroots organizations serving communities that haven't had access to capital, that don't have access, as Andrew said, in terms of the frameworks that free up capital. So I really think this is an important moment, and there's no better sector than the community sector to keep the conversation alive in terms of where what we faced. But also the reality is that doesn't go away. The impacts we saw don't go away because the pandemic's going to go away. They were in place already. So that takes us, I think, from priorities, really stabilized funding, if we want communities to change their business models, we actually have to give them the capital and the flexibility to invest in those business models, not the 6-month project or the 3-month project to try to change something or tweak an aspect of their organization. We're going to have to actually be invested in the long term. And I think that's important. And the last thing that I would say, Michael, and I think this is an important one, because I do think as we get to the end of this acute phase of the crisis, there will also be a real spirit and desire for Canadians to re-engage, to re-volunteer, to connect back to their community. And I think that's another opportunity for us in the community sector to say, how do we create those opportunities to really support Canadians to reconnect, right? To reconnect when it's safe back into their communities. And I think that's an important priority for all of us to think about.
Thank you, Dan. Amy, let me build on this train of thought, and while I'm certainly open to your sense of the priorities for the Red Cross, I can't help but appreciate that the Red Cross has probably lived off of crises as their business model, at least a good portion of it, for as long as I can remember. It is such an effective organization when crisis strikes. And yet what we're talking about likely is that while the pandemic has certainly been a crisis and we've responded with a sense of urgency, many of the issues that we've spoken about now are ones that probably have a more systemic and chronic component to them. Is there some sense of how the Red Cross is going to manage that? Or I know that you're probably not looking at crises disappearing anytime soon, but just the same, what's sort of the posture in terms of priorities moving forward for the Red Cross?
Yeah, no, and it's interesting because absolutely, and as we reflect back on our history, we have responded to kind of collective crisis, and that shaped who we are from kind of international interventions, our work in the war, World War II, the blood crisis, water safety, what was then a crisis. And so absolutely, that's kind of core to our DNA. And we certainly pride ourselves on our agility and capacity to respond. What I would say, though, is that we're still working with people who are impacted by flood and fire events. We still have a case file volume of individuals who have not yet returned to their home years later after Fort McMurray. And I'm certainly not trying to parallel, property damage and loss to COVID, but I do think that it does tell us that if we're still working with these groups, and in our longitudinal studies, we've discovered that impacts extend for 5 years after disruptive events. And given the rise in the rise in severity and frequency of disruptive events, I do agree with my panelists that we need to ensure that the sector's well positioned to respond to this collective crisis. And I think that we've shown in the COVID response the degree to which these community groups have been essential, and they'll continue to be essential in terms of supporting their communities to recover. What I would say, though, and I do want to address kind of the regulatory piece. Absolutely, it laid bare vulnerabilities. Absolutely, kind of we need to ensure that we're funding organizations for adaptation. In our support fund, we found that the highest need was kind of around the adaptation to continue service delivery. We saw that organizations needed to change their mind a lot, and the nonprofit's uniquely agile because it's not bound by charitable objects. And so it's able to respond to changing needs in community. And we saw that COVID transformed quite a bit, and it's not the same virus that we started with, in the most plainest terms. One thing that I do want to kind of address, and Andrew, I might be the disruptor on this panel because I have to say, I know that it's a common and a view of the sector that the direction and control rules prohibit the working with racialized communities, equity-seeking populations, and nonprofits. And I would respectfully submit that our $80 million fund is evidence of the fact that that's not the case. I think that we as intermediaries and funders need to challenge ourselves to work with these populations differently. And I do believe that the regulation is a little bit of a red herring. And so, I'd love to kind of continue the dialogue with you after the call. And I'm happy to have a conversation with anyone, because the most frequent question that we get relative to our fund is, how do we do it? And CRA, if you're listening, we didn't break the law, I swear to goodness. My legal team asked me to say that. Yeah, no, I think that that's just the place that I'd like to conclude as we look forward into kind of what the future holds for us and how do we kind of ensure that we're creating a ready Canada for an increasingly complex threat environment. And I'll leave it there.
Amy, thank you. Panelists, I have a third question, as you know, that we talked about, but we've got a couple of questions that have come in that I think I can integrate into the third round. So let me do so. The question that came from the audience it reads as follows. In recent years, Canada's ranking on the World Giving Index has plummeted. Why does it appear that Americans and Brits are so much more generous than Canadians? And I guess I would add to it the conversation that we had yesterday, which was that certainly the pandemic has challenged the charitable sector, at least portions of it, in terms of how it goes about its business to generate philanthropic contributions. Some have done well, but many have struggled. And so does the turning of the page into a post-pandemic environment offer opportunity or different challenges as we look at what the shape of philanthropy looks like? And so, Dan, let me start with you on this one.
So I know one of the things, it's a great question, and there's a couple of things. First of all, I think Canadians are really generous. I really do. I think one of the things we did is some research in the late summer was we found about 36% of donors felt the impact of COVID and had to reduce their giving. But one of the things we also found in our United Way experience was, as the impact of the economy certainly impacted some who had to reduce their giving, we also saw a real emergence of corporate partners and individuals who didn't feel the same sting actually stepped up. So there's an interesting, as I think about the future, the question for me is that going to rebalance in 2021 and 2022? Are those who felt the impact of the economic shock going to come back as donors? And are those who stepped up to give more going to feel the burden of that and retrench? So I think there's still a lot of uncertainty. I think the other thing that as a trend we've also been seeing is fewer donors, and those donors who are giving more. So that's great, right? The focus on transformational giving and major giving and has really been driving the revenue sources for a lot of organizations. But I do think it's unsustainable when the idea of our mass community donor base is shifting fundamentally. And I do think we have to ask questions about why that's happening. And I think part of that is income inequality, the distribution of wealth within our communities, the emergence of precarious employment that really affects the capacity of folks to sustain their livelihood. So I think there are a lot of forces at play, and some of them are about the economy and the way employment is evolving. But I do think if we've seen one thing, we've definitely seen that Canadians are generous, are going to step up. But if you think about the community services sector, these are not organizations that are built as fundraisers. They don't have large infrastructures to go find and recruit donors. They're dependent on community foundations and United Ways and others to support them. So I think that's the other side of this, is the infrastructure that ultimately the sector needs to mobilize resources. That's a high-priced and important talent. And it's something that a lot of our organizations on the ground in communities don't have. So how are we actually going to make sure that the philanthropic connection gets made back to those grassroots community organizations that are actually doing a ton of the heavy lifting in our communities?
Thanks, Dan. Amy, I know you're fresh off, but you seem to conserve some time there. So I want to throw over to you, Amy, on this question about generosity. And let me just reflect something and build on Dan's thought, though, before I ask you to respond, because I've always been envious, perhaps is not the right word, but I'll confess envy, if that's not a sin, about the Red Cross's nimbleness in terms of provoking that kind of response from Canadians to be generous in moments of crisis, because we can all empathize about what would happen if it happened to us. I'm not sure that's exactly the anatomy of that generosity, but I suspect that's part of it, because I certainly feel it as a donor. That said, we are entering into a different time, and I do sense in the context of a recovery that there is an opportunity for some, if you will, philanthropic democracy. That there's an opportunity for governments and businesses and other institutions to recognize that the leadership we are calling upon from them and their charitable organizations are going to be supported by an expression of philanthropy by individual donors. And I'm just wondering if you have a sense of whether there's something there that organizations like Red Cross and other perhaps smaller organizations might tap into.
Yeah, no, that's a tough one. No, and I'd say absolutely. We've been privileged as the Canadian Red Cross in terms of the amount of philanthropic support that we've received, and we absolutely are appreciative of the generosity of Canadians. And I'd give an example of that in the wake of the COVID-19 was the Nova Scotia tragedy, where there was a mass casualty, the largest in our history. And we stood up a donation portal, and we've been working with the affected families over the last year to fund them to kind of help support their needs, as well as navigation support, paperwork, things like that. That as you've lost loved ones, you kind of these types of things in the wake of such a crisis against the landscape of COVID is completely insurmountable. And so absolutely, I think that we've got kind of these lightning rod events that individuals feel compelled to give to, and we're appreciative that we kind of are able to be the channeling of that goodwill. What I would say though is that, philanthropic giving is, it is partnerships with private entities that are sharing their expertise. It is Canadians volunteering and giving back to their communities. I think that the philanthropic kind of activities is far broader than just financial contributions. But I absolutely want to echo the point that you're making, which is to say that, given the increased severity and frequency events, given kind of the predicted and predictable manifestation of a pandemic that we all projected would happen, could happen, and then we're shocked when it was on our shores, the degree to which we need to kind of have a collective call to action to ensure that we're ready and working in partnerships so that, we do better next time. And, I think that we'd be remiss if we didn't think that we would or will do better or will have this occur to us again. The other thing that I would kind of highlight on that point of generosity, and I think it is really interesting to kind of look at the impacts on the sector thus far. And I think it's too soon to say, but based on the latest data from the T3010 filings, and this is just going off of memory, but I think something like, 30% of travel expenses, and we were kind of chatting before this panel began, those operating costs have been reduced. I think it was close to 40% of tax receipted donations have gone down in terms of like galas and events and fundraisers. But in actuality, kind of baseline fundraising has been largely consistent. And I think that's indicative of the generosity of Canadians and the investment in collective response efforts. I could probably ramble on for hours, and I'm infamous for my terrible sense of time. So I will pause here, but I really welcome the conversation after in the Q&A, and I look forward to expanding on any of these points.
You're doing very well, Amy. It's your team has coached you, and your instincts are serving you well. Andrew, I know that the Community Foundation, their fundraising isn't as it has a special character to it, and so the relationships you have with your donors is typically deeper, more thoughtful, more considered. But that said, we are moving, as I mentioned earlier, from a crisis into a chronic systemic challenges that we have faced. Is there opportunity in your mind to deepen or expand the level of philanthropic participation in addressing these issues from a community foundation's perspective?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a few things there. Earlier on you talked about the Canadian giving in relation to some other economies. I think oftentimes we have to factor in that Canada has a very robust social safety net, and we put a lot of resources through the tax system into things like education and healthcare. And then when you compare us to the Americans, I think you have to normalize for that. because they do have much higher levels of philanthropy going into education and healthcare than we do. But at the same time, I think they just have bigger gaps. Fundraising and building resources during the last 17 months has been an interesting one. And, I'll go back to Tiff Macklin. We are currently living through a very unequal cycle. I'll explain to you how that works for endowment holding organizations. So we know that the top 20% of Canadians have done extraordinarily well in the last 17 months. And it's primarily because of one factor. The richest Canadians, so the top 20% of Canadians, they hold financial assets. They hold real estate, stocks and bonds, and equity in private companies. And all of those things have gone through the roof in the last 14 to 17 months. Well, guess what? Guess what philanthropic funders hold? They hold financial assets. And their asset bases have increased over the last year or so. In addition to that, as you mentioned, Michael, our relationships are with the top 20% of Canadians and with their deep, trusting relationships. So their wealth has also increased, and they're feeling the need to do something for communities, and they're transferring that excess wealth to organizations like community foundations, which is an absolutely wonderful thing. However, we cannot ignore the paradox. And you said this, Michael, we're looking at systemic things now. So our business model is reliant on the top 20% of Canadians. And we take the excess wealth that's created in the economic system, we endow it, and then we make grants. And those can range anywhere between as low as the DQ floor of 3.5%, could be as much as 10 or 12%. Almost every community foundation I know is granting well above the floor. And we're accumulating assets faster and at a higher proportion than we're spending assets. And so that's something we have to pay attention to. I won't be apologetic for asset growth or endowments, because I think they're really good things. Wealth and endowments can empower communities and uplift communities. However, much in the same way that inequality works in society, where too much wealth aggregates to too few people, that creates distortion and it destabilizes our communities and the social cohesiveness of Canada. The same exists for institutions within the charitable sector. If we have a few organizations that are accumulating too much wealth faster than frontline organizations, faster than BIPOC-led or BIPOC-serving organizations, or organizations working in the north or rural and remote communities, that creates a problem. And I think we have to rethink the philanthropic business model. Every organization that invests money is rethinking investments. We're trying to understand how our investments can not only earn income, but also do good and not perpetuate the same inequalities that the investment income is trying to resolve. And that's the philanthropic paradox that is so visible in the last 14 or 16 months. We definitely need to take a look in the mirror. We need to understand how our business model is both doing good and not so good, and try to fix those things as part of a broader transformation effort.
Andrew, thank you. Colleagues, we're just at the very end of our time, but I do want to throw one more lightning round question to you that came in from the audience. So if you can give us a 30-second answer, I'll start with you, Dan. What is the one thing that we should as a charity do to be more successful, to engage donors? And what is the one thing that we should stop doing?
I think the one thing that we need to do, and it's going to riff off Andrew's connections, we need to make the connection between the lived experience of communities on the ground and the sources of wealth. So that's fundamental, because we can have all sorts of dollars in endowments, in funds. But if the people making those investment decisions are not grounded and connected to their communities, then I think we're actually going to perpetuate inequalities because we're not grounded in the lived experience of our communities. So, that's fundamental. And I'll go back to the beginning, Michael, where I said we need to actually hold on to that community coordination response, that muscle we built through COVID and the pandemic. We actually need that in the recovery phase where we can actually make the connections between the community's capital and actually the thoughtful community guidance on the ground. So I think 30 seconds are probably a bit more. So I hope that's a good
start. You didn't say what you had to stop.
Yes.
Amy, you have a one thing to do better and one thing to stop.
I think that every organization kind of struggles with, and I think picking up on the panelists, it's that piece around credibility and practicing what we preach from soup to nuts. And I think that that's kind of the one point that I would make. And then in terms of what we have to stop, I think that we have to kind of, again, look, and I think that I said this earlier, look at kind of a collective view of what is philanthropy, the idea that people can loan their technical expertise, that partnerships can bring to bear their experience, and that individuals can volunteer. And sometimes it's not just about the money, is what I would say.
Thank you. Andrew, I'm going to give you the last word. One thing to start doing better, one thing to stop.
Yeah, I think the one thing we have to stop or take a good look at is this idea of donor primacy. Even in the corporate world, they're challenging shareholder primacy. The corollary for us is the donor. The donor, to Dan's point, oftentimes doesn't have the lived experience, and we center too much power with the donor. We need to have ways to engage the donor, bring the donor along, and then facilitate a transfer of resources that is equitable and is just. I think the thing that we need to continue to do, and that we're out of the gates on, is we're creating the infrastructure for the Social Finance Fund, which will be deployed in the coming years. And social entrepreneurship and social businesses are the primary way and tool to resolve inequality in Canada going forward. And I think if we can build out that part of our economy, we'll be best served. So continue on with social entrepreneurship and finance.
Andrew, Dan, Amy, thank you so much for this conversation. It's always a pleasure to talk to any of you, and to have you here collectively, I think, was an extraordinary privilege. Heather, I'm going to throw it back to you. I know you've got a little business to wrap up, and thank you again for this opportunity to share this with your audience.
Absolutely, my pleasure to everyone. Zina, did you have a few notes to end with before I finish off here?
Yeah, thanks, Heather. So before I hand it back to Heather to wrap things up, it's time for the moment that everyone's been waiting for. It's the draw for the free subscription to iPolitics. So I'll ask Amy Avis from our esteemed panel to choose a random number between 1 and 300.
Ooh. 200, big money.
Congratulations to attendee number 200 at today's event. You've received a free subscription to iPolitics. You don't know who you are yet, but we'll send you an email with all the details. Now over to Heather.
Thanks very much, Zina. I have to say I've been really struck by the candor and the critical eye that all of you have put on your own sector, and the forthcoming conversation that we've been privy to here. It's really it's been kind of a masterclass of adaptation, and I think it's a role model, kind of a template for everyone to use moving forward. Obviously, we have. I have to thank you very much for being our finale panelist of the season. But I think, sharing your knowledge and giving us a firsthand account of this critical and complex work that our charitable and nonprofit organizations have provided to Canada's most vulnerable people has really shone a spotlight on opportunity. What I heard from all of you is this has created an opportunity to be dynamic in your approach moving forward. Hate to steal a phrase from Tip O'Neill that all politics is local. I think what we have all learned today is that all policy is local. And your ability to adapt to the disruption with thoughtfulness and pragmatism is transformative. And so I have hope that in the future, that these inequities and paradoxes that are just very human at their core is something that we can grow upon. The first thing is, noticing that it's there, then talking about it, and then taking action on it. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how we can resolve this moving forward, and for your continued work. Really, communities have depended on all of you. So I think you need also a big kudos for what you have been doing. Nothing's perfect, and we evolve as we go. I want to thank everybody else for watching us today and for the time that you've given us throughout the season. I hope you've gained some actionable insights that you can take away from the discussion. So today's event and our entire season has been made possible because of the generosity of our sponsors. That is RBC Royal Bank, Shaw Communications, Welch LLP, Strategy Corp, and TD Bank. We're so grateful for your ongoing support. This is our final event of the season. As I said, I think we're leaving on a high note. We look forward to seeing everybody in the fall, ideally with an in-person component to our events, probably going to be a hybrid. Until then, stay hopeful and stay healthy.